Hi everyone, Dean Mawson here from The Only Way is Ethics, and we have Adrian Stavert-Dobson with us for episode 8, as it is going out. Adrian, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
It's really great. It's really great to have you on board. So we're gonna crack on. We've got some really interesting things to talk about in this episode. So what we'll do, Adrian, if you don't mind, I'll hand over to you so you can sort of tell us a bit about yourself, your journey into digital health, and once we've done that, we'll crack on with some questions and some topics.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Dean. It's great fun to be here. I've been looking forward to doing this all week. Yeah, so to myself, what can I say? I'm Adrian Stavert-Dobson. I'm currently CEO of SafeHand. We're a specialist consultancy company dealing mainly in 129 and 160 compliance and medical devices. So my day job is I run a team of people working in this space, but I suppose my background is a bit unconventional in that I'm a sort of a doctor and a software developer. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, I suppose, how I got into the industry, I suppose for me it kind of started as a 10-year-old when I got my first computer. My parents bought this computer that was supposed to be for their business, and it never went near their business, because I just got my hands on it and that was it. And it was the old-fashioned BBC computer, and it was just the best thing in the world. I just found it the most incredible toy. The idea that you could suddenly take this technology and just play with it and get it to do anything. It was just, you could be so creative with something that's so simple. And yeah, got this thing and started with the instruction manual. Just started at page 1 and started learning how to program, and it changed my life. And I just became, I suppose, that archetypal teenage geek sat in the bedroom writing code, but just completely fell in love with this thing, and don't mind saying, it was a complete obsession. And then during my teenage years, continued to do that. But then I was lucky enough to get involved in a few sort of commercial projects. I eventually discovered that you could actually earn a bit of money from doing this too, which was always quite nice as a teenager.
Great advantage, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And wrote a few bits of software, for schools and colleges and things, but then got this relationship with a local pharmacist, just a community pharmacist, through a friend of a friend who needed some software writing for his business, and so just started doing that. And really, that was my first introduction to the sort of commercial side of software, and actually doing stuff for other people, writing software for other people, understanding requirements, and it just happened to be in the clinical space, of course, which was cool. But I had a decision to make, really, is do I take my career down the IT line, or do I do something else? And I think in some ways I kind of decided, I'd ticked the IT box to some extent. I kind of scratched that itch and wanted to just go and do something different. So decided to go to medical school and became a doctor, and got the grades and went off to Leicester and went through medical school. And that was great. Medical school was brilliant. It's the old thing of, work hard and play hard, and it was fantastic. It was just such great fun. But right through medical school, even then, there was still a tech focus. I was in the right place at the right time, in that the university I went to had pretty good IT facilities, and would just go off to those back rooms where all the beardy weirdies sit, and all those other students doing other courses, and just sit and just soak it up, really, as to what those guys were doing. And I always remember it would have been about probably 93, 94. I remember exactly where I was sat, the exact room I was sat in, and booted up this thing that was called the World Wide Web at the time. Even the word internet wasn't being used.
No, it wasn't.
And booted up Mosaic, as it was then, the first sort of browser, and just started playing with this thing and was just entranced by it. The idea that not only could computers talk to each other, but actually you can just make that so easy to use. No longer were you typing in IP addresses and this kind of thing. You could just click on stuff and get access to all this information. And I think as soon as I saw it, I knew that was it. It was going to change the world. It was going to change the world. The ease by which we can now communicate and send stuff from one place to another was always just going to change the world. And I remember going back and talking to my housemates at medical school, and they were just like, "Oh, what are you going on about?" Just and I tell you, 5 years time, this is going to be massive. And I got so end up. I was right. I think qualified in medicine. I went on to be a junior doctor, which was challenging. This was the time before the sort of working time directive, so we were working 100 hours a week, almost every week, and that was hard. That was really difficult. And I think the realization quickly sets in that you've been having all this kind of academic fun at medical school, learning all this stuff, and then suddenly the sort of hard graft that suddenly comes upon you. I think found that frustrating. I think there was a dawning realization that actually maybe that wasn't the job actually I really wanted to be doing. I enjoyed the academic side of it, but dare I say, I found working in the NHS quite frustrating. And that's nothing against the NHS. It just wasn't. I think wasn't right for me.
Absolutely.
I find I'm very influenced by people around me and the mood of people around me, and I tend to find if I'm working in an environment where everyone is fired up and really loving their job and passionate about what they do, it has the same effect on me. But I tended to find I was in the NHS, particularly at that time, the sort of late 90s, everyone was just so down. Everyone was just felt miserable. Just the lack of resources and the demands that were being put on me. And I think that had quite an effect on me and didn't really feel that happy. But I think the other thing that was going to sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say it sucks the life out of you, doesn't it, Adrian? Sometimes, and having that similar sort of like experience, I think a bit of synergy there is that in my nursing career, sort of like I'd sort of almost run my course in relation to sort of like where you were at as well, and again, it's no diss to the NHS and obviously what it's trying to do. It's absolutely fantastic. However, you as an individual, like you say, if I think we both have a passion in relation to what we do, and sort of like if you can move that forward and surround yourself with people that have the same enthusiasm, then it's absolutely fantastic, and you can do great things in relation to that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing was as well that when I looked at my work as a junior doctor, I just found this whole thing so blooming inefficient. I would spend hours each day just handwriting, the name, address, date of birth, hospital number on sheets of paper and blood bottles on the phone, just endlessly writing it over and over and over and over again. And of course, sometimes you get it, sometimes you copy it right, and sometimes you don't copy it right. And at 4 o'clock in the morning when you've been awake for 2 days. I think as a software developer, I could kind of look at the healthcare system and think, it doesn't need to be this way. There's a better way of doing this stuff. When we look at the other industries have long since adopted IT, it was inefficient and unsafe, which two things that often come together, and that had a real sort of frustrating effect on me, I think. And I think when I think about, what was it that caused me to go into to leave medicine and go into health IT? It wasn't one thing, but I always think there's a couple of kind of sentinel events. And one, I always remember one night I was on call, and it was a particularly quiet on call, which was unusual for anaesthetics. And I just got half an hour while I was waiting for my next patient to come to theatre, and we just sat in the doctor's office writing a bit of code. Just I was creating some anaesthetic software, just mucking about. And a couple of consultants came in and just started asking me about what I was doing. They were on call with me that night, and just started telling them what I was doing. And one of them just said something that was really profound to me. He just said, "If I could do what you were doing there, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be consultant anaesthetist. I'd be doing that. That seems a lot more fun." And I think the reason that had such an effect on me was that consultant was somebody who had just been made a consultant. He'd reached the pinnacle of what we'd all been trying to achieve for so long, and yet it just felt so disenfranchised. And the other consultant that was with him, he agreed. He agreed with him. And I just went home that night just thinking, wow, that's really quite something. And I think that stuck with me. And then sort of around the millennium, had a sort of major life event in that my girlfriend at the time, later to be my wife, was diagnosed with bowel cancer and went on to die about 14 months later. And that was, I think, when something like that happens, it really makes you stop and think, am I climbing the right ladder here? Am I life is short, sometimes too short.
Yeah, totally.
And it does make you think, am I comfortable in this? And just by complete coincidence, I had a friend of the family who happened to be the chief exec of, I won't say which company it was, but a very large health IT company in the UK, a company that's still very, very well known. And I just had a chat with him, and he opened my eyes up to the fact that there's this health IT industry out there. For people, clinicians who can code, who are technical, there's a whole world of stuff out there you can be doing that I never even knew existed. I didn't go and work for him. I wanted to make my own way, but then just applied for jobs in health IT, and I thought I'll give it 6 months and see where I end up, and never look back. And that was it. And worked for various corporate organisations, and that was it really. And I discovered, this is what I should be doing. This is where I should have ended up. And I suppose that's how very long-winded story of saying how I ended up in health IT.
No, it's not. It's absolutely great, Adrian. It's really interesting, and I think it's really surprising. And I think on my journey as well within digital health, how the majority of clinicians that are in digital health, or quite a lot of them, I don't know what the percentage is, but it'd be really interesting to find out. And anyone in the audience out there, if they want to sort of send messages in and give their sort of stories, seem to fall into digital health. It's not something we don't aspire, do we? You don't become a clinician. No. Say someone says to you, what do you want to do in 5 years when you qualify? I want to be in digital health. And so,
yeah, that's right.
But interestingly, I think that may have been the case when we started in sort of like you said, late 90s going into the 2000s. I mean, my journey started in about 2004. Yeah. Around that time when I was at Barking-Oven and Redbridge and worked on the EPR project there. And you'll probably hear people sort of listening to this saying EPR projects in 2004, and it's sort of like, back in those days. They did exist, didn't they? They did exist back then. But it's that same experience of sort of like, we sort of, things change, don't they, within your life. And your sort of like, my outlook certainly changed. And then I got thrown into this world and like you, this EPR landed within our trust, and I was spending evenings not getting paid. I was sort of like, I was staying on site till sort of 9-10 o'clock trying to break this thing. And in the same vein as yourself, Adrian, looking at it and saying, well, that doesn't work, this doesn't work, and this could be more efficient. Why does it do this? And just asking questions. And if I forward wind to what we do now, it's exactly the same.
Yeah,
pretty much is what we're doing now.
Isn't that the fun of software, though? I've always found that with software. If you've got a physical product and you discover that it's suboptimal, whatever it is, scalpel, artificial hip, whatever, changing it is really hard. You're going back to that manufacturing process, getting through the medical device regulatory hoops. With software, it's easy. Sometimes too easy, of course. But if you see something that's just not right, you just change it. It's not that hard. You can make it better, and sometimes you can make it better in minutes. And I think that's the great thing about software. You can mold it, you can shape it, you can get it to what you want it to be. And that kind of work that we were doing those days, looking at EPR, saying that's not great, that could be improved. It's just so powerful.
It is. But with that, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it, Adrian?
Is. Yeah.
It's making sure you've got the right design development processes, the team, the people around you, the coders, and
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, the changeability of software is the best thing and the worst thing about it,
and the
of course,
worst
isn't
thing.
it? Because you can play with it, you can innovate, but as we know, because of what we do, it's got to be done in the right way ultimately, and there's got to be process and things involved, which I'm sure we're going to get on to talk about.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Well, no, thank you for that, Adrian, and sort of like, just an insight into your journey. Now, we both work in that sort of regulatory space, like, yourself at Safan Consulting and myself at DPM Digital Health. And I think there's only a few of us that can say, Adrian, that we've been doing this for sort of like, more than sort of like, well, me more than 15 years and you sort of like 20, sort of like, 20 plus. We see the ups and downs, and we see sort of like, the sort of like, the roadmap of clinical safety, regulatory compliance. So I'd just like to touch on sort of like first sort of, I'm going to go in with a hard hitter, sort of governance, and sort of like around that, because at the moment we're sort of there's lots of questions around the standards themselves. We'll come on to those, but it's looking at it sort of like, the governance nationally and also locally. So sort of starting off, NHSE's responsibility in relation to the standards, because they wrote the standards.
Mm-hmm.
They ask us as and health organisations, digital health manufacturers, and us in the support of those, to mandate those standards, because as we know, they're mandated under the Health and Social Care Act. But the existing discussions around who is the regulator in relation to DCB 0129 and 160. And when I was thinking about this episode and sort of having this chat with you, and I put on there, dare we pose a suggestion involving MHRA and CQC?
Yeah, sure.
What could their role be in relation to this? Because I am going to be frank, NHS England at the moment aren't really doing much in this space. We all know that, like, if you go to NHS England and you ask for advice and guidance, I'm not saying you don't get advice and guidance. However, they're very standoffish in relation to taking a formal position when dealing with manufacturers. Now, I understand why in relation to that, but it still doesn't help the likes of us and the likes of the manufacturers and health organisations in getting that support.
It's tricky, isn't it? And I'm sure anyone who's worked in this industry for any length of time has battled with this. To what extent is this best practice at one extreme, ranging to formal regulation at the other extreme? I think it's worth thinking about, what is regulation? Why do we need it? I suppose ultimately it's there as quality control, and clearly that is an issue. You and I, Dean, constantly see materials written for DCB 129 and 160 that perhaps aren't the best quality, and that organisations wouldn't get away with that if it was the case that this was regulated. I'm not sure NHS England's intentions were ever for this to be formally regulated. I think where we've ended up is actually what NHS England want. When I was back in 2011, 2012, when the standards were being put together, I was part of that consultation exercise. And the idea was then is that they put some standards together and let the industry run with it. It would be essentially self-regulating, look to very much the private sector to help out with consultancy, with training and so on. And I think that's worked. I think we're probably where we should be with that. But as for a regulator, have the MHRA got an interest in this? I don't think they have. I think the MHRA have got enough on their plate, frankly. Let's face it, they're in the middle of rewriting a whole new piece of law. I'm not sure the likes of DCB 129 is something that they'd be in a position to regulate. I don't think they want to bring non-medical devices into scope of what they do. I don't think there's appetite for that. So I suppose what begs the question, well, is it just a free for all then? You know, why bother? Why bother doing any of this? Well, I think there's something interesting to think about here. With medical devices, if we just have a comparison there, you know, if you do medical device work, you build your technical file, you build a quality management system. The way medical device regulation is set up is that even for a class 1, you know, class 1 self-certification, you're not obliged to show that to anyone. You know, you can do all that work. Nobody ever needs to see it, bizarrely, you know, or indeed you can not do that work, which is obviously unlawful. But let's face it, who would know? You know, unless the MHRA do a spot inspection or there's some kind of inquiry, a lot of organisations will chance it. Of course, it's illegal, but they will.
Yeah, now, no, absolutely. We see it. I'm sure it's out there, and I have seen examples of it myself as well.
Yeah, indeed. But what we've got to think about is 129 and 160 is different. It's not like that. Particularly when we think about 129, the idea is that you're creating materials that you then share with your customer. Now that's different. That's different to how medical devices work. And the big difference there is that the customer of that organization, so the customer of that supplier has got a commercial contract with them. And having reviewed that safety assessment, they are in a position to decide whether or not they take that product, you know, whether or not they contract, whether or not they decide to go live. And that's power that you don't actually have with a medical device outside of 129 done for medical devices, of course. Yeah. So I think that's where the real power of that standard comes in, that it's in the hands of the very people who are going to be paying you the money as a supplier that you need to run your business. That's actually quite powerful. And I think so long as the receiving organization are knowledgeable enough to know when something is good and when it's not so good, and then having that power to push back, I think we've kind of got what we need. Yes, it's self-regulating, but it's regulated through commercial contracts. And I think that kind of works. It does work. Until you have, of course, a customer receiving organization who doesn't understand what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. That's where that mechanism essentially stops working.
And that's interesting. You sort of talking about that and saying, you know, that you think it works in theory. It works how we've sort of like, you know, it's been established, and that's an interesting concept. And I never thought of it like that. That obviously, you know, it's almost self-contained, isn't it, within the NHS, within that sort of like the framework that the health organisations have. They have a responsibility, don't they, in relation to, you know, we have ownership. However, as we know, Adrian, at the moment, you know, even, you know, you talk about sort of like 2012, but you and me know that, you know, I did my training in 2008 as a clinical safety officer. So indeed, there has been a form of the standard around when it was DSCN 14
and before 18. Actually. Yeah, I mean, even within the national programme, it was done through commercial contracts. But I mean, I was a clinical safety officer in 2006, which was before any kind of standard had ever been thought of. But that's because it was just done in the national programme through the individual commercial contracts.
Yeah, so it's been around for, so, you know, if you're talking 2000, 2006, and I know awareness was nowhere near sort of like as great. So we're coming up for sort of 20 years, aren't we? Sort of like 18, around that 18-year mark, and still, my view would be, you know, the obligation of NHS England is to raise awareness in relation to standard, even if it's not regulated in that fashion, in a formal respect. We are still so far behind, Adrian, in relation to awareness raising. Surely there are more initiatives that can be done in relation to pushing this forward as a standard, and being a bit more hard hitting in relation to these are the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you don't do it. And I think, again, dare I say it, and again, Dean sort of sticking his oar in. That's been left down to us in the private sector as well. NHS England are not doing that well, I don't think.
Yeah, I think unfortunately I would agree, and I think that's where NHS England do come in. The premise of that kind of soft regulation with a small r, if you want to call it that, it relies on trusts, healthcare organisations being able to discern the good from the bad. The whole thing falls down if they can't do that. And so that does come from raising awareness. It comes from good quality training. It comes from good examples of best practice. And I think that's really where NHS England need to step in. They probably do need to up their game to some extent, but they are a small team. They are a really, really small team. And
they are.
I know they spend quite a bit of their time, dealing with individual queries and trying to manage the safety of national projects as well, because I think we probably lose sight of the fact that they're often doing clinical safety work on those sort of national level projects. So they're spread very, very thinly. But fundamentally, go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
No. I mean, no. You're absolutely right in relation to that. But they've now moved. I've been asking for this to happen, and they've now moved under patient safety, which I thought it just makes perfect sense. Yeah. Why does clinical safety sit under digital? I'm, as you've probably seen from other episodes as well of the podcast, I'm a big advocate for this to be cascaded down within health organisations as well. Mm. It's happening in some, and I've been part of those initiatives in some health organisations and supported that, which is absolutely fantastic, and I know you have as well. But they're a small team, so patient safety aren't a small team, and patient safety, they need to take the initiative, I think, in relation to that. They need to support that team, and they need to support the awareness raising, because when you look at the work that's been done recently around patient safety with PSERF and a lot of those initiatives, and if you look at the objectives, and there's a big push around training and pushing that out, and awareness raising around patient safety. And I asked the question, well, include clinical safety within those objectives, and if you do that and you support that, then maybe we can push this forward more as an agenda.
Yeah, I agree. So I mean, we've talked about NHS England's role here, but the real role comes from top management in individual trusts. And
absolutely.
I'm not saying that's not opinion. That's what we only need to look at other safety critical industries. Every safety critical industry we look at, we know that safety only works when it's led from the top. If you've got individual engineers saying, we've got to keep people safe, but that's been completely ignored by top management, you don't achieve a safe environment. You don't. And you only need to look at, I'm not probably going to name them, but well-known companies who have perhaps been in the press in recent times for accidents that have happened, and it shows ultimately it always comes down to attitudes at the top management. And we spend a lot of time doing this. I'm sure you do, Dean, as well. That we're working at the sort of coalface. We're engaging with clinical safety officers, clinical risk managers, individual clinicians who are actually quite passionate about safety and getting this right. But there's nothing driving it from above, or what's coming from above is a cursory, almost, yes, you have permission to do this, but it's not being driven. One of the things that I often find interesting, both within the NHS and also within the supplier world as well, is you can often ask the workforce, how often do you see messaging from senior levels around the importance of confidentiality and information governance and security? And often that's a message that's been driven home from senior levels. And then we'll say to people, how often do you get messages about safety in health IT? And people usually look at each other and say, don't think we've ever seen anything around that. And I think that's an obvious omission. That's where it's falling down. If it's not being driven from the top, then let's face it, these things just don't happen.
No, absolutely. And I'll put this out there here, a message to the audience, and we'll both sort of back this up, is that, there's a lot of EPR procurements that are happening at the moment. There's lots of contracts that are up, that are coming up to the end, and people are looking for more, for EPR solutions. And you're absolutely right, Adrian. As part of those projects, they, Health organisations must get that message across. They must communicate. They must start raising that awareness around clinical risk management, what it means, what your role is as an individual, how you can raise concerns, why you should raise concerns, and giving that, poster campaigns that sort of like all the different sort of like communications, the screensavers on your sort of like on your EPR systems. We should be seeing more and more and more about, and keep chucking it up every single week. Have something new in there. Have it scenario based. Make it relevant to the people that are out there as well. Don't just put up something that just gives the factual information around this is what clinical risk management is. It's what does it mean to those individuals in relation to their roles. As well.
It's that culture, isn't it? It's that idea that, as a workforce, we're all pulled in different directions. But if senior leadership don't see safety and health IT as being important, well, why should the rest of us? What kind of message is that sending? So, and I think the other thing that is often lost as well, we see this commonly, that organisations will often make bland statements around, yes, we are committed as an organisation to keeping people safe when health information systems are deployed. But when it comes down to actually saying, well, who is actually going to do that? One of the things that we see very frequently is that accountability is often spread amongst large groups of people, committees, who most people in an organisation don't have access to. And of course, when that responsibility or accountability is shared in inverted commas, fortunately what tends to happen is often not a lot, because everyone thinks it's someone else's responsibility. One of the things we see very frequently is when we see organisations doing safety well, trusts doing safety well, they've nearly always got one thing in common, and that's that they have got a named person operating at a senior level as what in SafeHand we call a safety sponsor. So that individual who says, yeah, actually it's not committee, it's me. I'm it. I am accountable here. And what you tend to find is then, guess what? Stuff happens. So when there is a problem with an EPR system, or maybe it's a resourcing issue, there isn't a CSO available for a particular project, you can actually go to that individual and say, look, what we're going to do here, this is kind of on you. What decisions need to be made? And suddenly you find that things actually start to happen. Awareness starts to be raised. Resources become available. So we always say that's one of the most important things for a trust to get in place, to get a safety sponsor who is actually trained and understands this stuff.
And that's really interesting. We'll come on to that later, where we'll talk a bit about some power struggles and stuff like that. But we won't we won't talk about that just now. But really interesting talking about that governance part and everything. And I'd like to come on to sort of like with all of this in light, and we speak about the sort of clinical safety officer, and so we've spoken a bit about national, local governance around the standards, and we've even spoken a bit about the sort of the life cycle of the standards, where they came from, etc., and then the elusive clinical safety officer and their role. And it'd be good to get your views around sort of, again, having been doing this for X amount of years and seeing the changing landscape, and in light of the ever expanding regulatory pathway, compliance pathway, which now includes DTAC, InfoSec, MDR, both national and international, ISOs, AI, dare I mention AI, in there as well. What do you feel the role of because we've gone from, Adrian, haven't we, the concentration purely being around 129 and 160 in whatever form they took over the years, and that's just forever expanding in relation to that.
Yeah, it is definitely. There's sort of, excuse me, my phone's just ringing. You're absolutely right. It's difficult to pin down often what a clinical safety officer is, and I've got a couple of views on that. I think the first observation is that in many ways, a clinical safety officer is what you want that individual to be. I'm not sure it's valuable to be very prescriptive about exactly what that individual should be doing, simply because every organization is different, and actually different CSOs have different skill sets, at the most basic level. Should we be including things like information governance and security for a CSO? I'm a big believer in people with the right skills doing the right job. I think to be a clinical safety officer, there's absolutely no doubt you've got to be a clinician and you've got to understand risk management. I think the things with security and with information governance, they are very, very specialist skill sets. And I wouldn't want to dumb down those subject matters by saying, oh yeah, you can just take a clinical safety officer and send them on a 2-hour course and suddenly they're experts in that area too. So I think trusts need experts in that area to be leading on that, and I don't think we should be diluting down the role of that clinical safety officer. Heaven knows most CSOs have got enough to do. We speak to trusts who've got 100, 150 systems that have never had a risk assessment done on them. Now telling them that they've also got to look after the InfoSec system as well is just going to be overwhelming. So I think the CSOs need to have awareness of it. They need to know who to talk to. I think when a CSO comes across an issue around security or information governance, they need to know where to go with it, and they probably need to work with that individual. But I'm not a huge believer in stacking more onto the inbox of the clinical safety officer. I think that's my view. So the other thing is around medical devices as well. This is a difficult one. The extent to which the clinical safety officer should be involved in medical device regulation, this is really challenging. And this is one area where I have to admit, I still feel a little undecided in my own mind around the extent of that. I think certainly if you're working in a trust, you're a clinical safety officer, and you're procuring a product that you look at and you think, yeah, this ought to be a medical device, and it hasn't got a UKCA mark on it or a CE mark on it. I think the CSO does need to probably be in a position to spot that. I think they do need to call that out, which is not an easy thing to do. Trying to understand whether a piece of software should be a medical device or not is so difficult. It's so difficult. But I think they do need a basic understanding to know at what point they call that out and say, actually, I think this needs to be investigated further. When it comes to suppliers, what extent does the clinical safety officer play there in medical device regulation? Again, I think that's really challenging. Your average clinical safety officer is not going to be familiar with how to build a technical file and how to put, ISO 13485 in place. That's not going to happen. But again, I think they probably do have at least some responsibility to point out to a manufacturer when something is looking like it should be a medical device and needs formally regulating. There's nothing in that about the standard, nothing even remotely suggested, but it just feels in spirit as though there probably is some responsibility there.
And that's interesting because if you look at the CSO landscape and within, not within health organisations, but within the private sector, there are a lot of CSOs that do pick up the sort of and support medical device sort of regulation in relation to that. I know we sort of like, I'm an internal auditor for 13485, but that's through choice.
Of course.
And you're absolutely right. And I would say my experience, as far as I go, Adrian, in relation to supporting sort of like MDR within the team, is someone else concentrates on the technical file, because they're well rehearsed in regulatory affairs and SME, and I'll look at clinical evaluation reports and etc. And the clinical sort of side of it. So you're absolutely right. We need to be really careful, don't we, with sort of like, if a CSO, it's a fine line, isn't it, about being sort of like, where does it stop and where does someone else's sort of like support and role start in relation to that? Because you're right, you're in danger if you take on too much. And I've learned this the hard way, and I think we all have within our journeys. You take on too much, then all of a sudden you're spinning a lot of plates, and you're trying to you know, and it's all with good intention. It's not sort of like, you know, but all of a sudden it's like, oh, hang on a second, I need some help in relation to this, because this isn't my bag, this isn't my expertise in relation to that.
Yeah, and I think you learn that as a clinician, don't you? Certainly as a doctor, I was always very aware when I was in a clinical scenario where I was reaching the limits of my knowledge. And I think most clinicians are quite happy to say, you know, I need to refer on to someone else. But I think sometimes with regulation health IT, we're sometimes less reluctant to do. We're more reluctant to do that. Certainly with myself, you know, my skill set is around 129.160 and 49.71, and I can build technical files, But then I know when it comes to, for example, clinical evaluation, that is such a specialist skill set. You know, building a clinical evaluation report from scratch, that's not me. I've got somebody in my team who does that. When it comes to information governance, security, again, I've got enough knowledge of it to know when I need to talk to somebody else. And again, I've got other people in my team who do that. I've got a 1345 consultant. So I think it's the right person for the right job. And that works both for suppliers and in trusts. It's important to not play at things. I think particularly with regulation, if you're going to work in this space, you've got to be confident that you know what you're doing. And if you don't know what you're doing, well, probably get somebody else to do it, at least until you get your time where you've learned how to do it, shall we say, if that's your intention.
Absolutely. Which is that whole, I think it's so important, and bringing on within that CSO role is the whole mentorship side of things, because I think that's, and we spoke previously about NHS England and their role, and I think that would be a really important role if NHS England, you know, aren't the regulators, etc. They need to push forward mentorship programs and sort of, which can easily, I think, be cascaded down at the health organisation level, and can be supported at that level. And I think it would be really good to see a national mentorship program, and that CSOs, dare I say it, that CSOs once trained, you know, can't sign off or approve documentation until they've done competency in relation to sort of like moving that forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the idea that you can go on, you know, a couple of e-learning courses, or even, you know, even a couple of day courses with ourselves, and come out a risk expert, you know, go in, right. It's absurd. Not only is it ridiculous, but I think it's actually quite harmful to the industry, because the message you're sending is, hey, you know, you can do this just with a couple of hours of e-learning. That's all you need to know, which really dumbs down the complexity and the nuances of the subject. The only way you can do this is to learn on the job. If you think about our own clinical safety officers, so we've got 16 CSOs in the business, and we when we recruit CSOs, sometimes those individuals have done clinical safety work before, sometimes they haven't. But I'll be honest, either way, we train them from scratch. But it takes us a good 6 months before we've got someone who we can start to step back the sort of mentorship a little bit. You know, when people first join us, every single word that they write, every decision they make is looked over by at least one other person, their line manager. So the idea that, you know, you can learn this from a few hours of e-learning is just absolute nonsense. It just doesn't work like that.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think we see it, and I think the danger is with having sort of like, you know, if you see the e-learning programs that are there in respect to the NHS courses, you've got intermediate, you've got the sort of, you know, the foundation and the intermediate, the essentials in the intermediate. And I've spoken to some people, and they think that just by doing those and not doing the practitioner course, they're like, oh, I'm a CSO now. And it's like, you know, I sit there and I'm like, no, it's sort of like, you know, you really need to sort of like, you know, some support in relation to that. And we are in danger of having a workforce of CSOs that are very junior in what they're doing. And the population is growing of CSOs, as we know.
It is.
But we need to make sure that we're on top of that, and that they're getting the support that they need.
Yeah. And I think the other thing as well, I think we do have to question this idea of you can do a little bit of training, and then from that point on, you can then not only do clinical risk management but teach clinical risk management. I think that is a dangerous line to go down, and I think we both just acknowledged the importance of that mentorship, but I think also the mentorship has to be good quality too. And one of the things that we get frustrated with is we'll sometimes see people sharing, for example, a safety case from one organisation to another, saying, here's a safety case we've run, and we can talk about the pros and cons of sharing information. But I think the problem is that sometimes those safety cases are not actually very good quality. And the message it sends to the receiving organisation is that they'll look at a poor quality safety case and think, oh, is that it? Is that all I have to do? I thought it was going to be quite complicated. It looks like all I have to do is take the NHS England template and add maybe a few sentences to it and paste in my hazard log. And that's it. I've got what I need because that's what they've done. So mentorship is a good thing, but it can also lead to negative training if we're not careful. It can give a message that actually there's very little to do here, very little effort needs to be put in. You can just copy other people's materials. I think that is a really dangerous line to go down.
Yeah, it has the opposite effect, doesn't it, Adrian? We've again, that workforce of CSOs are out there and they're misinformed. In relation to that, and this is why I'm not a big lover of a lot of discourse channels in relation to that. They have a purpose. The purpose is not for sharing sort of best practices per se to clinical risk management, and it's a difficult one, isn't it, in relation to this, because you've got health organisations out there and you've got individuals within there that need help, so they're going to reach out to the community, aren't they? The community, no one's out there trying to cause harm or cause issues.
Of course,
no one gets up in the morning, do they, and says, right, I'm going to cause maybe hell when I get out as a clinician or working in sort of digital health. However, it's when there's that lack of awareness or how things are done, what does good look like in relation to clinical risk management, and there's that lack of understanding, then it can cause harm.
And don't get me wrong, I've got absolutely nothing against people sharing safety cases. Of course, I mean, that's how, if you look at how the airline industry works, you have Boeing and Airbus, traditionally competitors, and yet they share safety data all the time. They collaborate on these things, and of course it's the right way to do things, and there's no issue with people doing that kind of sharing. But it comes with two caveats. One, if you're sharing something on the basis that this is good practice, this is what things should look like, that's got to be the case. It really does need to be a good example. And also, and I know we often speak about this on the coffee and chat, if you are the recipient of information from another organisation, you can't just take a safety case and put your trust name on it and say, there's my safety case too. And so many people do. We see this. It's such a frustration that a safety case is about evidencing your journey from A to Z. And if actually all you do is borrow someone's safety case, well, you've gone from A to Z without going through any of the letters in between. It's the journey that you follow, not the end point, that's important. So it's a constant message we're trying to reinforce. I think that's another danger.
Oh, absolutely. So we've now spoken about sort of the role of the CSO, and we're now sort of getting on to that sort of like the safety documentation, etc., and how key it is to make sure that it's done properly. So in taking the safety standards, and in light of that, let's forward wind 5 years, okay? And we know at the moment that there is, keep being told that the standards are under consultation. At present, we all know, and I even get prospective clients and clients, etc., questioning, saying, Dean, these standards have got a date of 2018 on them. What's going on? Where do you see the standards in 5 years, Adrian, in relation, or where would, or another question, where would you like to see the standards in
That's two different
in
questions,
5 years' time.
And I'd hope those two would align. But okay, so I suppose let's cover off the big things. Will we still have the standards in 5 years' time? I think we will. I think we will.
Yeah.
You know, the nature of safety and regulation is very rarely does safety get deregulated. It just sends the wrong message. So I think we will. Will they be aligned with medical devices? As we've talked about already, I think that will be limited. I think there may be cross-pollination, but I doubt one will replace the other. I think in terms of the standards themselves, I think it is probably long overdue, a bit of an update, shall we say. There are a number of, in my mind, a number of requirements that are missing from the standard. Obvious things that we see. I mean, just to, let's cover a couple of those. If you look in the standard about the responsibilities of top management, there's hardly anything in there. You know, we've already talked about the importance of top management and culture and so on. And what does it say? It says, oh, well, you've got to make sure that you've got competent personnel and that you've got a clinical safety officer and that sufficient resources is provided. Really? Is that it? I think there needs to be an acknowledgement of what we've talked about, this idea of some kind of safety sponsor or representative in top management, that just feels like such an obvious omission. And then when we look at things like the live service side of the standard, there's a few things in there that always amazes me. So if you look at what you're obliged to do when an incident occurs, what does it say? You've got to log it. You've got to kind of vaguely say, sort of assume it's resolved, try and make sure it's resolved in a timely manner. And that's kind of it. And to my mind, particularly on the 129 side, what we frequently see is issues being raised with suppliers, fundamental issues with software, and then there's no responsibility in the standard for that supplier to actually tell their other customers, to make them aware that there is a problem that's been identified. So you could find a serious safety issue, but according to the standard, there's no obligation whatsoever for that supplier to inform their other customers. Now compare that with medical devices. If you find a problem with a medical device, it's a whole rigmarole. You have to go through with, corrective action, preventive actions, with field safety, corrective action. There's so much to it that just isn't there in DCB 129. So to me, it's really obvious things like that just need a bit of a fix. The other thing that always amazes me is that there's nothing in the standard that says that you should prioritize a fix for a product influenced by its clinical safety profile. And in fact, this is what most suppliers are doing in the safety world. If they're doing it correctly, an incident arises, it's assessed from a safety perspective, and then that risk determines the priority of the fix. It's such an obvious thing to do. There's actually little or no mention of that in the standard. So I think things like that need clarification, even if it's not in the requirements but the implementation guidance. I think there can be a lot more work done there. Other than that, do I think it's going to radically change? I don't think it is, and I think it's a really boring thing to say, and that's because actually, to some extent, don't fix what isn't broken. A lot of the standard does actually work quite well when it's done properly. The problem isn't the standard. Often it's the learning and the knowledge and the awareness of it that is challenging. But yeah, I think that's what it will be. In terms of the community around it, I think that will have changed. Just in the last 2 years, we've seen this enormous growth in things like the coffee and chat, the discourse groups, the physical meets that are happening now, and that's brand new. That's completely brand new. That absolutely was not there even 18 months ago. And I think that's the seed of something that is really going to change how this is done, because suddenly there's going to be a collective voice. There is going to be mutual learning, mutual understanding, forging of best practice. I think that's now possible in that people are starting to come together and talk about this, and trust, at the most basic level, trusts now have got CSOs. In the way that they didn't really have them exceptionally 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that's the biggest change that we're going to see in this area around the community, rather than necessarily the standards themselves.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, because if you break it down and sort of, risk analysis, risk evaluation, risk control, it works. Like I say,
yeah.
if it's done, if you apply it, the methodology in the correct manner, it works.
Yeah, it
and
does.
like I say, it doesn't need fixing, and it's something that stands the test of time.
Yeah.
However, you're absolutely right. There's tweaks, isn't there, Adrian? It needs polishing in certain areas. Top management, you're absolutely correct. There needs to be more attention. There needs to be more focus around that top management. Even if the NHS England put sort of like an example, sort of like that structure of where clinical risk management fits with that responsible owner, like you were saying, that safety sponsor in there, and even some sort of like responsibilities around that safety sponsor.
Indeed,
some key responsibilities around the safety sponsor. What the expectation is in relation to that, because what it does, it focuses, like you mentioned before as well, it focuses on an individual, because and we know this always happens. There's lots of Teflon shoulders within the NHS, and sort of like, lots of things slip off, and it's not me, it's someone else, etc., and stuff like that. And like you say, it gets diluted down, doesn't it? And nothing happens. And as we know within safety, sort of like culture, that's just that's just alarm bells, isn't it? Start ringing in relation to that.
I think something else as well is
No, you carry on, because I was going to move on to.
I think another thing that we see all too often is this perception of safety being an administrative thing. It's this idea, it's another hoop we have to jump through, another box we have to tick. For goodness sake, can we just put, we'll run a quick workshop, we'll put a hazard log together, we'll just produce a 5-page safety case at the end of it, and we've achieved our objective. I think there's still a message to get across here. We see that too often, that safety is something that has very real world benefits, and actually not just to patients. But the idea of doing a safety assessment is that you go through things at a very granular level, and as you do that, you come out with real world actions. Because if you think about it, this is something we always reinforce in our courses. If you don't actually change something, you can't affect the safety profile. It will always be where it started. Unless you actively change something about the product or its configuration or the way that it's tested, or that you train on it, or all of those things, if you don't change any of those things, the safety profile will stay where it is. So if you don't change anything, your safety assessment becomes just what is the risk associated with the default product in default conditions without any safety work being done. That's not what the standard's all about. It's about putting things in place. And I think we see so many hazard logs that are high level. We see hazard, users might not be trained properly. Control, will train users properly. Those kinds of cartoon hazard logs that are there purely to tick a box. But what characterizes them is that you can't take an action from them. We train users correctly. You can't do anything with that. For safety to work, the data that you produce as part of your hazard assessment has to change something, has to have real world action. And I think that's a message that isn't quite getting through the industry yet. And I'd like to see that change, I think.
No, absolutely. They need to have more substance, don't they, in relation to that. Too many times we've seen hazard logs, like you say, that have just got, dare I say, I've seen some causes that are just like 2 words.
Yeah, indeed.
Two or 3 words in a list, and it's just sort of like, well, you need to tell me what that means, because otherwise it's completely ineffective in respect to that. So coming on to, so we've spoken a bit about sort of like those standards, and really interested in saying about sort of like, where we envisage in 5 years, and maybe, Adrian, what we can do in 5 years' time, we can come back
Oh,
Oh,
yeah. That's going to be horrendous watching this 5 years back in it. Why did we say that? And why didn't we say
sort
that?
of like, yeah, why did we do that? Why did we say that?
Yeah,
Because none of this has happened.
that's right, exactly. Yeah,
And actually, surprise, surprise, here, the standards have gone.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, neither of
And
us
we
have got
said
a
they
business
wouldn't.
team.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and everything will be a sort of like car crash. That's never going to happen.
yeah,
But I'd like to come on sort of like this the manufacturer versus the health organisation, and I say versus the health organisation. It's not versus. It should be sort of like that collaborative approach, but sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We've got this, as we've said, this continuing battle to raise clinical risk management awareness. It seems to be sometimes there's the provision of resources for digital health projects, and then trying to build up that relationship so you've got effective communication between manufacturer and health organisation, and in all of that, both parties trying to get to grips with the clinical risk management process.
yeah.
And as we know, this can be, it's almost like picking it out of a hat to say good process, bad process, indifferent.
Yeah,
Sort of like within those projects. So I think with your experience and within sort of SafeHand, how do you find sort of like that landscape and tackling those issues?
Yeah, I think the relationship between the sort of the trust and the supplier is it's always an interesting dynamic, isn't it? And it has to be measured correctly. I think we see two extremes. I think sometimes we'll see organizations that are, what can I say, maybe a little bit too cozy with their suppliers, in that actually they let things slip. It may be that stuff, what can I say, is procured, does go live under the radar, sometimes kind of under the procurement radar. We have to remember in DCP 160, we do have this responsibility to do intelligent procurement, making sure that suppliers have got 129 in place. And some organizations have really got that working well now. They've really got that working well. Nobody gets through the door without either DTAC or 129 in their hand. But unfortunately, sometimes, yeah, you do see sometimes certain individuals deciding to maybe subvert the process and procure sometimes departmental small systems and not follow that process, and that really isn't helpful to anyone. I mean, we complain about it from a safety perspective. You would imagine the trusts are probably tearing their hair out themselves with all sorts of other issues around that too. I think that's got to be managed. But I think the other thing can be dangerous as well. Sometimes, relationships between trusts and suppliers can be a little bit too antagonistic. Sometimes people can be inflexible. I think, sometimes we see this. Maybe a customer will come to us who needs 129 for the first time. They put their hands in the air and say, we should have done this long ago. We know. And then they talk to maybe 3 different trusts. They say, we've got SafeHand on board, to do our materials. And 2 of those trusts will say, great, by the time we go live, all of that will be written. We'll share drafts and everybody's happy. And sometimes you'll get that one trust will just talk to the hand. No, if utterly immovable. Absolutely, unless this is signed and sealed, thank you very much. And they're completely inflexible. And I can understand why. In many ways, I'd rather them be like that than be like the earlier trust who just lets anything through, of course. But I think there does need to be that relationship, that understanding, that working together ethos. But that there has to be that healthy tension. I think that's really important between a healthcare organisation and a supplier. I like that term, healthy tension. I think that works well, and it needs to be at that sort of level.
That's a good. I like that phrase, healthy tension. It's good, and I completely get it in relation to that, and you're completely right. But I think there is a part. You're absolutely right, and agree with you that you'd rather people erred on that side of like, no, you're not coming through the door at all unless this is all done, etc. However, there are situations, though, Adrian, where you've got, and we've all been in this situation. I feel that you've got a manufacturer, they've got a good product, they're green around, 129. Their awareness wasn't there, and they come to you with good intentions. They're not saying this is a box ticking exercise and I just want to get this across the line. They're saying we need to get this done. We're prepared to put the resourcing into it. How do we do it? And they really come. It's a genuine sort of ask for, like, we want to get this right and we want to do this. However, you've got a health organisation that's just like, flatly sort of like, it is quite a difficult one, isn't it? When they're sort of like, no, we're not letting them through the door, and it's like, that this product's gonna really, it could revolutionise some of your services, or it's really going to help as an enabler. However, you're putting up these barriers that really sort of, I'm not saying they're not necessary, but how do we get around those sort of like those scenarios?
Yeah, it's important that the trust push, because of course often we're pushing an organisation to get on and do their 129, and it's important that their customers push in the same direction. So that's I think that works well. But I think if we've got if let's say we're working on the supplier side and their customer is being really black and white about this, we'll sometimes say, how about we get a customer on board? How about we get them involved in the risk assessment? They can contribute to that. And then what's more, as we write the materials, as we create drafts, well, let's share them with that customer. We're not going to wait until the safety case is signed and sealed and in 2-3 months time, whatever it is. Let's actually get some drafts out there, get feedback and bring them on board. And we find that kind of works really well. Ultimately, it's a collaboration. It's not, we talked about healthy tension, but ultimately we're all pulling in the same direction, which is a safer product, better care, safer care of patients. That we're all pulling in that direction. That's what everyone wants.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's about, and we do the same sort of like, if you can share that, share that hazard log, even if it's in a draft form. If you show willing, I find, and again, a message out there for sort of like the audience as well. If you show willing and you're happy to, to share your documentation, and it's going with open arms. I think it's been honest. Honest is the best approach, isn't it?
Yeah,
just saying,
exactly.
Look, we're working through this process. Here's our, let's work together. This is where we're at the moment. These are the hazards we've identified. We're looking at these mitigations. We're looking at these controls. What's your input? Where can we sort of like, etc. And I'd be very surprised if like sort of a health organisation's going to sort of like, push back against that and say, no, you need to go away. You'd be very surprised in that.
And of course, it depends on the product, doesn't it? If it's a bed management system which is lower risk versus something that's going to calculate the dose of a chemotherapy agent, then it's it's different. It's about context, and isn't it, and justification?
Yeah, no, totally. And I work with sort of dose calculation like organisations, etc., and stuff like that. And you're absolutely right. Your risk profile is sort of like is up here, as opposed to I'm sort of moving beds around and looking at sort of like discharge sort of like dates, etc., and stuff like that. It's sort of, that's more about your administrative side.
That's right.
Now that relationship though between the manufacturer and the health organisation, and sort of like you touched on it already around sort of there is, we know from the national programme, Adrian, that and I think most people are aware of this now, that historically there was a lot of influence between, it's like who rather than the actual product itself. And unfortunately that still happens in relation to that. And it's that influence on projects, and also if there's sort of power struggles I've seen within health organisations, and you've got people that are on the rise and they want to get to a certain level, and I need to get this in relation to that, against us trying to deliver safe and effective digital health technologies. What would your advice be to sort of, because if you're a CSO in that position, and I know we've sort of touched on this, but not necessarily in respect to the power struggles or people talking about that, but they are evident. And I've been involved in projects recently where I've had the same, and and we've had a chat about that. So what would your advice be, Adrian?
I think politics and safety don't often go well together. that there's often a bit of a tug of war between the two. I don't mind sharing. I've in a former life was in a situation where I was working in safety internally as a, not clinical safety officer term hadn't been invented, but essentially that's what it was. And I ended up in a situation where I was thrown off a project, and indeed, believe it or not, my security access was revoked for a particular office where certain things were happening, and so things can get very political in safety. Wow. And I would say, if you haven't had that happen to you, you haven't kind of worked in the industry long enough as an internal CSO, because it's only natural that sometimes as a CSO you do have unpopular things to say. You do that's what you're paid to do. But it has to be a mature organisation who will, who will listen to that. And I think this is where an independent CSO really comes into its own, because when we work with organisations, we're not party to any of that politics. We can actually put it to one side and say, let's just look at the evidence here. Let's just do this risk assessment. Let's produce the data. Let's look at the evidence, the safety case if we can. And that then tells us our messages. It tells us where those gaps are. It tells us where the level of risk is acceptable or not. And it's wonderful to be able to do that in a vacuum and just say, here it is, these are the facts, because you haven't got that gun to your head of sign this off or you lose your job. Yes, we may lose a contract, but hey, we'll look after 150 customers. We're not going to sacrifice our business for one customer doing something that's not right. So and in fact that doesn't happen. We tend to find as a consultant, if you go in and say, I think this needs to change, it happens in a way that if an internal person hadn't done that. So I think that does help enormously. I think if you're inside an organisation as a clinical safety officer, it is more challenging. But I think that's when that leadership comes back in. When you've got that critical friend above you in senior management who you can go and speak to and say, look, I've got these pressures. I'm expecting to sign this off. I'm uncomfortable here. This doesn't feel right. For whatever reason, there's some politics, there's a power struggle at play. Maybe there's a relationship that's too cozy, something like that. You need to be able to go to that individual and just say, this needs to be revised. Obviously, if that individual is involved in that politics, then it's a different matter. But you would hope that's not the case. So it is, and it's a challenge in every safety critical industry. If you talk to safety engineers who are experienced, they'll tell you about the woes of those times when they've got into arguments with senior management, or indeed lost their jobs or been forced to resign because they've had to make unpopular decisions. It is fundamentally the challenge that we have in safety that's very well recognised, I think.
And I think it's really interesting talking about that and about these power struggles, etc., and stuff like that. And something that we do on our mentorship program, one of the exercises on there is, and this is for the audience, because we've literally just done this with Kate Reynolds and her team at Norfolk and Waveney. I don't know whether you've watched the space shuttle that fell to Earth. It's a documentary on the BBC. It's a 3-part documentary, and I would advise any CSO out there to watch that and do a little exercise of watching that documentary and then trying to align it to any projects or your organisation as well, and try and see if there's any similarities in relation to the attitudes and the approach that was taken. Use that, we use that as sort of like a lessons learned, because it just what it does, it shows that it's not just us. It's not just in the NHS; it's in all industries that we find sometimes these attitudes, and that awareness needs to be raised, and things need to change in relation to that as well.
In SafeHand, we have this little thing that we sometimes call a "How would this look?" test. And if you see an organisation doing something, you think, let's wind the clock forwards. Let's say 3 years' time. Let's imagine someone did come to harm, a patient did come to harm. Let's imagine there was an investigation. Let's imagine we ended up, where the Horizon scandal, and people were being called in front of committees to give evidence. This decision that we've just made here, whatever it may be, would we look back on that and regret making it? Or the way that we tackled this, we've just decided actually, we're not going to train our users. We're not going to bother training them. We're just going to actually let them loose on it and hope that things are okay. If we were to look back on that, would we regret that, making that decision? How would that look? And if we decide that we wouldn't be proud of it, well, tell you what, let's not do it now. Let's do it a different way. Let's not set ourselves up for that situation. I think that I found that quite a useful sort of yardstick to measure how far we should go with some of these things.
No, that's absolutely great. So, Safan, Adrian, and just talk a little bit about sort of like the business. So, what do you find? So, you've got an organisation, you've got 16 CSOs, you've got 140 organisations that you're managing. That's a lot. It's a lot to tackle on a daily basis. But what do you find your biggest challenges are in relation to that, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest challenges actually is looking after so many customers, because of course people expect quality and they get quality, they do, but that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen by accident. To give people that level of service that our customers feel happy, that we feel happy with. There's a lot goes on behind the scenes. There's a lot of project management and making sure that everyone is supported. Our team leads in Safan, my colleague Julia Cawthorne and Sue Davis, are just absolutely incredible at their jobs, and big shout out to them. Safan couldn't operate in the way that it does without those two people. They're the crux of everything operationally, and they're just amazing people. I suppose in terms of day-to-day challenges, my personal biggest challenge is always, I think this is the case for any business owner, is matching, getting the right number of staff in your organization and getting the right staff as well, because it's really difficult, particularly in a consultancy business, to think, have we got the right? We've got 16 CSOs. Is that the right number? And if we have too many, then obviously we're paying people and not bringing in the revenue. We become less profitable. If we've got too few, well, ultimately we will give poor service, and we'd stress out our CSOs. So that is always a challenge. And then when we do recruit, it's getting the right people. Because there's no point us generally recruiting for an experienced clinical safety officer, because there are so few of them. The pot that you're recruiting from is very, very small. Experience will often mean 6 to 12 months of experience for many individuals. So we're looking for those soft skills, and it's just being able to find that person who we speak with and think, yes, that's it. They've got those consulting skills. They understand tech and feel passionate about it. Importantly, they've got the writing skills. That is actually one of the biggest issues. Writing, the job that we do involves a lot of writing, and unfortunately not all clinicians have that fluency, that sort of forensic accuracy that you need in this world. So it's checking that we can take someone on who've got all those facets to their skill set. And we've recently recruited a couple of people. I've probably spoken to 30 or 40 people in the course of getting those people on board. And that's time consuming. It's time consuming for me. We do work with a recruiter, but even then, we still have to talk to a lot of people, and we have to turn down a lot of people too. But of course, that's the right thing to do, just to make sure we absolutely get that right person, because ultimately it's a people business. It is what we do is so people focused. So we've got to have the right people, and we get it right most times. I would say we do get it right most times, but it's important and it's not fair to other people if we take them on and they're not right for the role. It's not fair to them. So
absolutely,
we are discerning, and it means we've ended up with a team of extremely talented people who are very, very good at the job, and I've just got so much respect for. I often say it's funny when I wasn't a boss. I used to look up to my bosses and think, wow, these people are so powerful. These amazing people who have got all this power over me and what I do in my job. And when you are a boss, suddenly you look at your workforce and you think, these people are so powerful. They're so amazing. Safebank couldn't be what it is without any of these people. They're it. Yeah, I'm the CEO, but ultimately I kind of do the recruiting and I do the accounting and make some of the big decisions. But other than that, it's that teamwork and the culture and having a nice place to work that makes Safebank what it is.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that should be most organisations, shouldn't it? Should do the same in relation to that. And it's lovely to hear, Adrian, in relation to that. And we're all on the same path, and we're all like sort of trying to get to the same goal, aren't we? To sort of make sure that we make things safer in relation to that. Which leads me on to you're at HET.
We are indeed. Yeah,
you are, and there's a reason. It's one of the reasons you're at HET, which you've seen, which I'm very sort of intrigued about, is obviously Safety Logics.
Yeah, that's right.
So this your digital platform, which has been sort of like in development, Adrian, for obviously a number of months.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about Safety Logics?
Yeah, so I mean, when I first set up the business 8 years ago, I thought, right from the start, there's going to be two arms to this. There's going to be a platform and there's going to be consultancy. And then the platform side of it, it was just never quite the right time to do it, I'm a developer by background, and I think, should I develop it? Should I do that? Should I sit down and create that platform? And nearly did so many times, wrote the specification for it and everything. But I think we've needed to wait until the time's right. And probably about 18 months ago, we made a decision, say, we need a platform. And why do we need a platform? Because of what the market is telling us. And certainly when we're out there running courses, we hear the same thing over and over again, which is we find it really difficult to capture a hazard log or capture risk assessment data in the form of a hazard log using a tool such as Excel. And this isn't me having a go at the NHS England template at all. It's me having a go at Excel. What is Excel? It's a tool that's built for accountants. It's there for crunching numbers. It's not for dealing with huge amounts of text. That you need a different tool for that. We've never used Excel for doing our hazard logs. And when I set up the business 8 years ago, I did develop a tool. I did develop a platform, but it was just for internal purposes. It wasn't for, and most people will know that. They'll have seen the slightly unusual style of hazard log that we produce. So we realized the community out there was crying out for something better than Excel. So what we've done is we've taken the tool that we've developed internally, and it has been continually developed over the last eight years, been refined, and we've made it into a commercial product, into something that we can offer as a SaaS tool, a software as a service. And basically people can subscribe to the service, and what it offers is there's two main parts to it. One side is lots of training. So, but what we've done is, rather than run, hours and hours of me speaking, we've chunked it into bite-sized nuggets. So here's 3 minutes on FMEA. What's it about? Start to end. Here's a minute and a half on what is harm. We see harm in the hazard log. What does it mean? What's it all about? And it just means you can go in there and just get that information really quickly. That's the sort of what we call the learning zone side of it. But the other side of it is, we can sometimes call it a hazard log builder, but that doesn't really do testament to what it is. If you think about when you're doing a risk assessment, what you're actually doing is you're capturing a lot of data. You're thinking about what are the failure modes, what could go wrong, what are the controls, what's the level of risk, and that's a data set. It just so happens that we often then articulate that as a hazard log. But what we've done is we've separated out capturing that data, structuring it, analysing it, with then being able to press a button and turn it into a hazard log at the end of the day, as well as various other formats. So that's what we've done. We've got essentially a drag and drop interface. It's a very graphical tool. It's something that you can start using, very, very quickly, having probably didn't just had a demo of it. And you can start using it, and you can use it in risk workshops. You can use it sat at your desk to build out that data set. And then at the end of it, you can say, Actually, yeah, let's produce a hazard log in, if you wish, in the NHS England format. So you can press a button and it will actually turn it
Okay.
into that format if you wish.
Okay. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
we can actually say, let's produce it in the format that Safehand have produced for a number of years. Or actually, let's put it into Excel so that we can then, if you really want to, run some macros against it, or do it this way, or do it this way. You ultimately, you're separating out the data from its presentation, and it's really just a dead simple tool that CSOs can use to put their data into and effortlessly create that hazard log. And then, of course, when it comes to write the safety case, well, it's actually an awful lot easier if you've got that data in front of you. Because we can analyze that data, we can say, actually, how many training controls have we got? How many training controls have we got that we've either evidenced or not evidenced? And then when it comes to writing your safety case, you can tell that story really easily because all the data is in front of you. So that's what we've been building. We've been very busy doing it, and we're unveiling that at HET next week. Really exciting opportunity for us, and yeah, really looking forward to that as a sort of new venture from Safehand.
No, that's great. No, it's really good to hear actually, because sort of, you know, we're in that. I keep saying we're in that digital age, aren't we, Adrian? And we're still putting things in Excel and Word documents and all that sort of stuff. Yes,
Yeah.
there are some sort of like risk management, but they're not just risk management. I mean, you've got soft comply, you've got a number of tools out there that do things in the generic risk management sort of space, and they do it. They do it well, and they support different technologies. But it'd be really good. I'm very excited. Obviously, I'll be at HET as well, so I'm very excited to come along and have a look. And it's your first time exhibiting as well.
It's our first major exhibition, and absolutely. So yeah, that's been a big thing for us as well. So obviously, getting ready for any exhibition is always a challenge. Doing that at the same time as launching a project is another one. So there's 8 of us in the team. We're going to have half the team down there on the stand on different days.
Brilliant.
And yeah, it's going to be fantastic. I mean, exhibitions are always great. You always get to meet loads of people, lots of discussions. It's not what happens on the stand, it's all those coffees that you have and chats and meetings in the corridors and things that are really helpful. And so yeah, it's always good to get out and about.
Yeah, it's the bit for me. I go to quite a few, and as people know, and it's the best place to network and to meet people, and that's what it's for ultimately, isn't it? I mean, yes, you've got oodles and oodles of stands with lots of sort of like products and people wearing their wares, but it's those key conversations, isn't it? That can spark off different initiatives and sort of like move things forward within the organisations on there.
And then as soon as we've got the sort of stand finished there, we've then got, I know, and you're going to, we've got Giant in December. We're speaking at Giant as well, so we're doing we're doing one of those panel discussions, which we're really looking forward to. Which is probably going to be exploring a lot of the things that we've talked about on this call as well. So yeah, really looking forward to that, and then seeing where that gets us.
No, that's fantastic, and it's good to see you sort of like out and about. And as you said, we're at Giant as well there. Adrian, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you.
I've really enjoyed this.
Before you go, I do this with all my guests. So if there is one thing the audience can take away in relation to what we've been talking about, sorry to put you on the spot. But if there is one takeaway for the audience, that, you know, bit of advice that you could give in relation to clinical risk management, what would that be?
Yeah, it is, and I think it is straightforward. It is something I mentioned earlier. It's change stuff. It's that when you do your risk assessment, when you find stuff, change things, do things differently. It's, you know, when you look at your testing and you think, actually, we haven't tested that, and that might be all right. No, change it. Put some new test scripts in there. You know, those SOPs that we kind of drafted them, but we never really finished them. Nobody really signed them off. Change it. Do something about it. Get them finished. Get them signed off. Get them approved. It's about taking action, and it's about linking your safety assessment to doing something that is a change in the real world that actually makes a difference, and not just making this an administrative process. I think that if people see it that way, that is the one thing that will change the way we all do our jobs.
Brilliant. That's absolutely great, Adrian. Adrian, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic having
It's a
you
pleasure,
on episode 8 of The Only Way is Ethics. For everybody out there, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. And stay tuned for episode 9, which will be me on my own, just doing a roundup of the last 4 episodes. So that will be coming out next week. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Dean.
Cheers, Adrian.
Bye now.